Okay, so the passage is 1 Corinthians 11, 1 to, 2 to 16. So, I will read that, yeah? So, now I praise you, brethren, that you remember me in all things, and keep the ordinances as I delivered them to you. But I would have you know that the head of every man is Christ, and the head of the woman is the man, and the head of Christ is God. Every man praying or prophesying, having his head covered, dishonoureth his head. But every woman that prayeth or prophesieth with her head uncovered, dishonoureth her head, for that is even all one as if she were shaven. For if the woman be not covered, let her also be shorn. But if it be a shame for a woman to be shorn or shaven, let her be covered. For a man indeed ought not to cover his head, for as much as he is the image and glory of God, but the woman is the glory of the man. For the man is not of the woman, but the woman of the man. Neither was the man created for the woman, but the woman for the man. For this cause ought the woman to have power on her head, because of the angels. Nevertheless, neither is the man without the woman, neither the woman without the man in the Lord. For as the woman is of the man, so even so is the man also by the woman, but all things of God. Judge in yourselves, is it comely that a woman pray unto God uncovered? Doth not even nature itself teach you that if a man have long hair, it is a shame unto him? But if a woman have long hair, it is a glory to her, for her hair is given her for a covering. But if any man seems to be contentious, we have no such custom, neither the churches of God. Okay, so admittedly this is quite a difficult passage. We have to get some context to this, and that is that in the first century in Corinth, for a woman to have her head uncovered was to give out a clear signal. Now, any idea what that signal was? Well, it happens that in Corinth they had temples to foreign idols, as we know, and some of the priestesses that served in those temples would go about with their head shaven, or they would have their heads uncovered as a sign of availability, because they happen to be temple prostitutes. They're engaged in temple harlotry. So there is some significance then to head coverings in that respect. But as we'll see, there is some significance also not just to a head covering in terms of a veil or a hat, but also a head covering in terms of hair, because hair covers. And in fact, the Greek that Paul uses here talks about from the head downwards, which could be hair, or it could be a veil, or it could be some kind of hat. But basically, this word for head covering encompasses all three of these. It could be any one of these three. Okay? So it's not as simple as to say this is about wearing a doily or a scarf or whatever else. Okay, it's not as simple as that, especially when you start to delve into the Greek and also the customs and the context. So, how does Paul begin his discussion of the covering of women's heads? Well, he says, doesn't he, in verse 3, that the head of every man is Christ, and the head of the woman is the man, and the head of Christ is God. So he's beginning with an argument from the God-ordained order. And he's saying that man's head is Jesus Christ. We know that. It's quite clear to us that Christ is the head of the body. But what about between a man and a woman who are married? Well, the head of that woman is the man. We know that to be the case, the headship arrangement in marriage. And also, he says, the head of Christ is God. Now, we could have a problem here if we don't understand the nature of headship. Because if we start getting into, as some literalists might have you believe, if we start getting into the realms of women being inferior to men, then we have a problem with the Godhead. Because in verse 3, the head of Christ is God. But we know that Jesus is divine. We know that he's God and that he's equal to the Father. So we can't be talking about an inferiority relationship here. It would be wrong of us to place women in a category that is sub-standard to men, that she is not his equal in nature. Okay, so what do we mean? We mean then that Christ is equal to God in his essence, in his divine being. The posh word for that is ontology. And so too in the nature of man and woman, we are both human. Men and women are both human and therefore equal in nature. So we're not talking about superiority or inferiority. What we are talking about is that lovely word, submission. And this is God ordained. So to be submissive, well, a man has to be submissive to Christ, and a woman has to be submissive to her husband. But of course, that has to be exercised. His headship has to be exercised as Christ exercises his. Now, how did he exercise his? Well, he gave himself up, didn't he? He gave his body up, and his blood, his life, for humankind and for the church specifically. So it's in that respect that we understand how it is that a man exercises this level of authority. Okay, so what about turning our attention to the covering of heads? Well, this is where it can get a little bit difficult. So in verse 4, we're told that every man praying or prophesying, having his head covered, dishonoureth his head. Now, you could argue that's a custom, because back again in the first century, for a man to wear a hat, or a head covering, was to indicate that he belonged to another person. That is, that he was a slave. Okay. So no man is slave to another, and it would be totally improper, therefore, for a man to wear this head covering in the context of the first century, because who's he a slave to? He's a slave to Christ, not to any other individual, not to any other man, certainly not. So it would be a dishonour. But it's interesting too how people out of respect, men out of respect, still take their hats off. I don't know whether you've noticed that sometimes. Occasionally at maybe a church service or a funeral, a cortege passes by and a man will take his hat off. It's a sign of respect. And so it is that the removal of a head covering is necessary for a man to honour God. That is his symbol, that he removes any head covering and that he glorifies God. But what about a woman? Well, this is where it's different, because in verse 5, but every woman that prayeth or prophesieth with her head uncovered dishonoureth her head, for that is even all one as if she were shaven. So it's different for a woman in the first century. If a woman wore a head covering in the first century, it would indicate that she was married. If she didn't wear it, we've already mentioned at the outset, it would look like she was involved in some kind of sin. So the head covering was necessary to indicate before onlookers that she was betrothed, somewhat like where you wear a wedding ring, quite a similar sort of thing. But also it was a sign of the order that God has set within the church. So we are talking about customs, but we're now also talking about the first century context, but we're now entering into the church setting. Now why is that? Well, verse 7 says, "For a man indeed ought not to cover his head, for as much as he is the image and glory of God." Now it says, "But the woman is the glory of man." So out of recognition, not just, we've argued from the custom of the setting of the first century Corinth, we're also looking at the head covering as being what? As a sign of submission to the man in church. As a sign of submission to the man, or the husband in church. And it says that the woman is the glory of man. Wow. It says the man is not of the woman, but the woman of the man. Neither was the man created for the woman, but the woman for the man. Popular verses in the 21st century. Well, do you know, I think what's happened here is that those verses are often focused on and exaggerated and contorted by the radical feminists, particularly who argue against patriarchy. Patriarchy, as you may know, is that men always seem to hold the highest positions and the positions of power and exert oppression and oppress women. And so radical feminists say here is just another text of patriarchy in action. But we've just said, haven't we, that Christ is our model, is the model for the man, is the model for the husband. Are we really saying that Christ is an oppressor? Are we saying that Christ exerted his headship like a slave driver, like a dictator, like a Napoleon? Of course not. Quite the opposite. So again, we have to get it in perspective. And the other thing to mention as well is that this account is applying to the marriage, is applying to the church, and the theology behind that is something called complementarianism. That is, that the woman is to complement the man in those spheres. But what happens when you get outside of those spheres? That's the grey area. That's the area where a woman has to make that decision before God. So is she going to go into work? Is she going to have a career? And if so, is she going to be a boss in a company, an executive, whatever, with men in her charge? Well, that's for her to decide. Some may decide, no, that's inappropriate, and someone will extend the order beyond church and home into that sphere. Others, their conscience is clear and they're happy to go to work and boss men around. So I have rich experience of this. Now, what about verse 10? This is a really interesting passage as well in this verse in this passage. For this cause ought the woman to have power on her head because of the angels. Wow. So the Bible talks about angels being as ministering servants, I think it is. But they minister, don't they? Where do angels minister? Where are angels? Well, we don't see them, but where might they be during the public assembly, when the congregation are together? Well, Paul is saying here that the angels look on. That's something else, isn't it? That in the church, it's not just us. It's not just Holy Spirit. Just because we can't see those things doesn't mean they don't exist. So God's order, God's chain of command, so to speak, well, even the angels see what's going on. And so it's not just about us, it's not just about the immediate context, it's also the spiritual realm, which is quite something. So when we consider how we're going to view this conscientiously, then we have to even take in account those unseen spiritual realities. Okay, so verse 11, nevertheless, neither is the man without the woman, neither the woman without the man in the Lord. For as the woman is of the man, even so is the man also by the woman, but all things of God. So here we have, and let's face it, the feminists don't really home in on this, do they? But Paul is helping us to get the balance, and he's saying, well, just remember that the man, well, he's neither is he without the woman, and that is why in the beginning God created Adam and he created Eve, and so woman complements man, but man needs woman. So that helps us to get a better understanding, and it also helps to appreciate that in the marriage arrangement, when we come together, the husband doesn't wag his finger and do as I say and so on, but there has to be discussion and agreement, and then decisions are made. That's how it should operate. He should not be king of his castle and order people around like some tin pot Pol Pot, tin pot dictator. That is not the essence of a good Christian marriage. But equally, nor should the woman be unwilling on some occasions to submit to the man if there are major decisions to be made and there has to be a final decision. Can the woman sort of let it go? Can she, even if she knows she's making a big error? Well, it is a test, and you know what's interesting as well, it's a test for not just for women, but I think it's a test for men, because there are a number that shirk this. Some men who shirk this responsibility, who don't take a level of responsibility, and that's where marriages can fall apart, because there's a failure for the husband to be protector and provider, and spiritual welfare officer. Do you see? There's a lot going on that he should be doing, but there are many men who would rather be a couch potato and just let the woman do it all. Well, again, that's not the Christian way. So, verse 13, judge in yourselves. That's a really good expression to help you make your mind up over this. Judge in yourselves. Is it comely that a woman pray unto God uncovered? Doth not even nature itself teach you that if a man have long hair, it is a shame unto him, but if a woman have long hair, it is a glory to her, for her hair is given her for a covering. So, judging yourselves, and what do you judge? Well, what's the woman going to do? She's permitted to pray, we've learned. She can prophesy in the church. Is she going to do so uncovered? Well, Paul then says, just look at what covering she has already. Arguing now from nature, he says, a woman has the glory of her long hair. That's a glory to her, and it's given to her for a covering. Just as a man would tend to keep his hair short and not look like a woman, so a woman has long hair and she looks like a woman and it can serve as a covering. Now it's at this point that you have to decide for yourself, I think, you and your husband or you and God, what Paul is arguing here. Is Paul arguing this way? Is he saying, after producing a lengthy argument about wearing a material head covering, is he saying, not only should you be wearing this material head covering, but already nature teaches you that women have long hair, and that long hair is God's way of showing you that already she has a covering. So how much more, it's called an a fortiori argument, how much more so should she be wearing the head covering, that is, the material head covering. She has long hair, God's given her that. By nature teaches you this difference, but so therefore in the church, go on and wear the head covering. So we see a slight difference between hair being a natural covering, but in the context of public assembly, the veil or the head covering being something that is additional. That's the first argument. The second argument is Paul extending this and saying, okay, we've talked about coverings. That covering, do you remember at the start I said the Greek word is to fall down from the head? Is he just carrying the argument through and saying already woman has a head covering, and that head covering is her hair? You see? Is that what he's saying? That already that's the covering. And so whilst in first century Corinth, yes, there was this this wearing of a literal veil or not, and the various reasons why one would wear it or not. In this case, Paul is saying, well, you've got your hair. Now you could go down that road, because men in worship normally would wear head coverings in the Jewish assembly. Isn't that interesting? That the men were to wear head coverings, especially when reading the law. Have you ever seen on television maybe where they put the, and then they start to read from the scroll? But now something different is happening. Now Paul is saying, no, you don't wear your head covering. So you can see how this is ambiguous. And the ambiguity, to my mind, says this is what a woman, husband, family should decide before God themselves. And if a woman decides she wears a head covering, then God bless her. If she decides otherwise, then God bless her. But as long as she does it in good conscience before God, that is enough, is it not? And so we find that in some churches a woman will wear a head covering and some won't. And of course the dangers, I think, with head covering sometimes is it goes to the extreme of what kind of head covering is it? How much of the head will it cover? Does it go from the lower part of the neck? Does it go from the nape of the neck? Does it go to the fringe? Is it just like a monk's tonsure? Is it something like that? What is it? You see, and we can get into so much legalism about head coverings, not just about wearing them, but also what kind. If you really want to go down that route, then first century, often it was a head veil that was worn. So, and of course, another important factor is that by getting lost in the debate about head covering, we can so easily overlook the principle behind all of this, which is what? God ordained order in the church. God ordained order in the family. That's what it's about. So a woman could very well wear a head covering, but be a complete rebel, renegade. You know, she could be a nagging, rebellious, argumentative wife. And a man who doesn't wear one, as we said, could be a bully, a perpetrator of all that is unchristian, and thinks it's okay to beat his wife and hit her and so forth, and that does go on. So all of this really, once we start to read beneath the surface and get the Holy Spirit involved, helps us to appreciate this is not just about putting on a garment. This is about godly order, about submission, and how God has set things so that they work together. And if we keep in with that order, then things will function. Once it kicks out of order, well, in the church, for example, that's when churches, frankly, dwindle away and die. And we only have to look at certain institutional churches that have brought in the views of radical feminism and anti-patriarchy and so forth, that those churches are, well, as one archbishop said recently, that church in particular I'm thinking of will be dead and gone within a generation. That's his view, an ex-archbishop of that church. Well, we don't want that to happen. But if we start to do things God's way, that's when he can use us, when he can bless us with his Holy Spirit and things come to life. So really the whole passage is a test for both men and women. Man, husband, are you doing your duty? And woman, are you submitting? Verse 16, but if any man seem to be contentious, we have no such custom, neither the churches of God. So this is where Paul's saying, look, this should not be a matter for contention. It should not be kicking up a fuss and creating division and argument. Interestingly, there's a head covering movement in the States. The head covering movement, maybe you've come across that, bringing back the head covering into church. And there are other churches who will say, no, you're not allowed a head covering. Well, we've already discussed this, haven't we? The best way forward is to, verse 13, judging yourselves. Okay,